What is it that made them so effective during a change in crisis?
If you have a really strong vision, you can keep yourself grounded. You can ground your team.
The two words that we anchored against were change and crisis. And how did these two words interplay?
Because almost all crisis creates not just immediate anxiety, but financial anxiety. Every time you promote somebody, right, they've got to learn a whole new ethos, a whole new language. But the common denominator, crisis and change, clearly is anxiety and fear.
It was probably the most connected that I've felt in my 25 plus years being in the food distribution industry.
The more you can identify the unsatisfied need, the more successful you're going to be as a leader.
There's a common theme here as we were looking at whether it's Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt, either the Roosevelt, Churchill, is storytelling.
We've got to surround ourselves with strong people. We have to figure out how to get the best out of all of them. So a great lesson is Washington listened and Washington trusts across a great cultural divide.
Welcome to Crave, the IFDA podcast. My name is Julien LeBlanc, your host for this series of great conversations with industry and non-industry leaders. The food industry is evolving rapidly, and so are its leadership challenges. Our mission with IFDA podcast is to help you stay ahead of the curve with fresh leadership insights and strategies. Before we get to today's guest, I'd like to recognize Cut and Dry, our sponsor for Crave. Cut and Dry is the nation's leading e-commerce platform offering the seamless ability for distributors and their partner manufacturers to promote and sell more cases with our best-in-class operator user experience. Well, I must say, friends, I am super excited and I feel privileged and honored to have our special guest today, Dr. Peter Cressy. And his body of work and impact is simply outstanding. So I'm going to try to maybe do it a bit of justice to give you a feel for what Peter's done over the years. Dr. Cressy is currently the Director of Executive Leadership Programs at the Washington Leadership Institute for the past 8 years. That's been the role that he's in. And to give you a flavor, because we're going to toggle between military, academia, and the business world, is Peter served for 28 years in the United States Navy in command and senior staff positions. And just to give you a flavor, key appointments included the State Department, House of Representatives, the Pentagon, and several commanding officer positions with assignments all over the world. He concluded his career as commander, an admiral, Fleet Air Mediterranean, and commander, NATO Air Mediterranean during the Desert Storm, in command of 16,000 personnel and 8 joint naval bases. A big thank you for your services, Dr. Cressy. And also, Peter spent time in academia. So Dr. Cressy, 8 years in higher education as a college president, Massachusetts Maritime College and University Chancellor, University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, where he was also a tenured professor of management. So you can start seeing his passion for leadership. And finally, and this is where I think it's going to be interesting, the parallels, because Peter spent a lot of time in space that are very parallel to our IFDA community here. He served 16 years as the president and CEO of Distilled Spirit Councils Trade Association. And look, I could go on and on. You've got so much you've accomplished. You should be so proud of the impact you've had. And with that said, Dr. Cressy, welcome to Crave.
Delighted to have this opportunity to speak with your members, and you're quite right. There's a lot similar between the distribution of food and the distribution of adult beverages, as we like to say, and we often do them simultaneously. So great to have the chance to speak with you and your members.
Absolutely. And look, well, I thought a good starting point, as I mentioned, the Washington Leadership Institute. Maybe tell me a little bit about the Institute and its purpose and all the great work that you're doing there.
You know, the Presidential Library was built 11 years ago. A wonderful quote from George Washington: "I only have one more building to build at the end of his presidency, and that's a place to house my personal and military and civic papers." As it turns out, he gave the military and civic papers, as you could imagine, to Congress, and that created the Library of Congress. And he never did. He died before he had a chance to build a library. And so here we are, 200 50 odd years later, and we finally built it. And within this presidential library, very pleased that we've been able to put together a series of vibrant programs that we house in the George Washington Leadership Institute. Why do that? There are dozens, hundreds of good leadership institutes. It's because I think the importance of history, right? We can learn so much from history. So rather than Dr. Cressy or Admiral Cressy pontificating on a particular leadership point, we can bring that out through history. The stuff we talk about, all of your executives already know, but it's good to be reminded. It's good to put that into a coherent body. So we do a lot of things with boards. We do a lot of corporate boards. We do a lot of trade association boards. Do a lot of senior staffs and we also do a lot of strategic retreats. And more recently, we've done a lot more with emerging leaders, helping people in that middle management role begin that process of ascending. And the lessons of history are always so germane, and they're very powerful. Plus, we have the incredible environment here. As you can see, this beautiful leadership hall donated by David Rubenstein. We have a whole wing here at the Presidential Library for education. And of course, there's always the opportunity to visit George Washington's home, the mansion, walk through his gardens. And you really want to have fun, go up and visit his distillery, which I'm very proud to say I raised the money for 22 years ago.
Wow.
So I'll stop there.
Fantastic. You mentioned David Rubenstein. We're going to talk leadership. I read one of his books recently, I think it was a couple of years ago, where he took all the excerpts from his show.
And he's very, very supportive of Mount Vernon and has interviewed people right here on any number of occasions. And it's so appropriate as we've begun the celebration of America 250. We're doing a lot on George Washington taking over the troops in Massachusetts 250 years ago today. Basically as he started to go north after having been appointed the commander-in-chief. And next year we'll celebrate Declaration of Independence, and then we'll have a series leading up to, celebration of the Constitution, which of course was ratified in 1787, 1788, and then, right up through his presidency. So his length of service is just extraordinary, and there's so many lessons we can learn.
No, it's fantastic. And to your point, what a venue. I look at your picture just visually to ground our viewers, whether you're watching this on YouTube or listening to us. Look at that fantastic picture. Wow. It's a great backdrop. Well, look, I think it's a good place. So we're going to talk leadership, and let's start. So obviously George Washington, but there's other great leaders, Lincoln, Roosevelt, Churchill. If we were to look at maybe, because there's some similar traits, and yes, they're very different leaders, but what is it that made them so effective during a change in crisis? Those are two big words, but let's play with those two words.
Yes, and as you know, I've had the chance to do keynote talks around the country on these four great leaders leading in times of crisis and change. Look, I think it begins with a very solid sense of strategic vision, supported by what we often call here strategic patience and strategic agility. And most strategic plans never capture this fundamental notion of strategic patience. And if you have a really strong vision, then throughout crisis and change, you can keep yourself grounded. You can ground your team by constantly coming back to the end game. Well, let's look at Washington. Ask yourself, what was his goal at the beginning of the war? What was his vision? Now, by the way, he never used the term strategy. It was always design and plan. The word strategy doesn't come into being till about 1840. And the essence of his is to win the war, of course. Why would you ask that question? But listen, it was to establish a united country that supported democracy and established the rule of civilian law over the military. He recognized, as a reader of history, mind you, He didn't have a lot of formal education. His father died when he was 11. His formal education's over by the age of 14. But look, by the age of 17, he's taught himself surveying, solid geometry, trigonometry. He was a lifelong reader. Everything from agriculture to Cato, right? And all of that era was enlightened by the Age of Enlightenment, by the Renaissance. And he recognized that, people like Cromwell, who came so close to giving up power but didn't. And then after him, Napoleon didn't give up power. Castro didn't. Lenin didn't. Go on and on. And with the exception of the great Roman general Cincinnatus, you can only think of Washington as the one who walked away. And in fact, George III said, his nemesis said that if he really does go back to the farm, he must be considered the greatest character of the age. So it's having that vision and leading, acting, and managing to it. Look at Lincoln. Keep the country united. And this goes then to the point of strategic patience. Both Washington and Lincoln had a very astute sense of this. Washington writes a famous letter to John Hancock. No, not the first great insurance agent,
Yes.
but rather the president of the Continental Congress. It says, look, after they run him out of New York, said, look, we have a militia. We don't have an army. They're not trained to fight pitched battles with a trained army and navy of the British forces. We must trade time and space. And we're going to have to be patient. But look, you just go to the winter of 1776, December. They've gone from 17,000 troops to 3,500 or 4,000. Thomas Paine writes his wonderful Common Sense, and there's a surge of new recruits, but they're all new recruits. Now he must combine strategic patience with strategic agility. What does he do? He crosses the Delaware on Christmas Eve, captures the Hessians on Christmas Day, and then lures the British down into a intersection of a famous creek in the Delaware River, bloodies the British nose again, and then, quote, retreats. Doesn't look like a retreat because he goes up a back road, captures Princeton, and then exhibits patience again by retiring to the New Jersey Highlands for the winter. Lincoln does a very similar thing. Look, Lincoln writes the Emancipation Proclamation in 1861, doesn't deliver it until 1863, listens to his staff. They both become very good listeners, by the way, which is a key leadership trait. And when he first wants to put out the Emancipation Proclamation, he's convinced not to do it because it will split the North, because he's run on a campaign to unite the country again. He doesn't want to overemphasize demolishing slavery, which is very much in the back of his mind, until the timing is right. He looks again to do it late in 1862 after a defeat. And they say, don't do that. It'll just look like you're trying to recruit black soldiers. So having this, and Roosevelt, he can't get into World War II immediately. And he's got, Churchill just beating on him every day. Every day, communication, you've got to come save us. You've got to come save us. I can't do it yet. So I think it is that sense of vision, that sense of patience, that sense of agility. And I think it's a good place to start when we talk about leadership.
Wow, those are important words. And I think they're words that we all need to be reminded as leaders that we're playing a long game. And if we have a clear vision, clarity is a beautiful thing. And then to your point, you mentioned some big words because patience, agility, and timing. How many times you have friends, I'm sure, that are entrepreneurs, that had a great idea, but the timing was just, they're either ahead of their time or too slow to move. And so let's talk about because the two words that we anchored against were change and crisis. And how did these two words interplay?
Now, I would ask you, ask your members that may be listening to this, go back and think where you were March, April, May of 2020. Should we wear 2 masks?
Yeah.
Should we keep 12 feet, 6 feet? Can I talk to people? Is COVID going to be spread by touch, by breath? We're nervous. Remember the first time you or your spouse went to the grocery store? What did you do when you brought the food home? Put it on tables in the garage, left it there for 2 days so all the germs would get off it. Crisis almost always creates tremendous anxiety. And certainly the revolution, people were on both sides of the issue. You didn't know if the enemy was going to come through your town. Would you be able to feed your family? Because almost all crisis creates not just immediate anxiety, but financial anxiety, cultural anxiety. We saw all that during COVID. We had social unrest. We had an economic recession. Now, change creates a lot of individual and personal crisis. You just think about your employees. You give somebody a promotion, and maybe you move them to a new store. You move them to a new city. They have to change their commute right. Let's say they're a single mother. Or they got to get up earlier. How do they get there? What about childcare? This or that. They just compound that for everybody that's working for you. Every time you promote somebody, right? They've got to learn a whole new ethos, a whole new language. So recognizing the change has a lot of anxiety. So the common denominator, crisis and change, clearly is anxiety and fear. And you have to deal with it. This requires a leader to be a really good communicator and to be highly visible.
Wow. First of all, you brought back lots of bad memories in those first couple of weeks of March 2020. But you know, what's I always find fascinating as someone that's super interested in the psychology of change with humans and leadership is humans don't like change for the most part, but we do really well with change once we're led in the right direction. And I look at most people that came out of this moment in time we experienced. And look, we probably wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't for the gift of COVID. I didn't even know what Zoom was prior to COVID, in fairness, right? But what do you think? So if we were to bring it back to some of the leaders that we mentioned, whether it was Washington, Lincoln, never let a good crisis go to waste. And leaders understand that leaders are made during crisis. Do you think that sometimes it's good to create a bit of a bigger crisis than what's at play in order to really move or force an agenda? I'd just love to hear your thoughts around.
No, I wouldn't create a bigger crisis, but I certainly would be alert to crisis. And let's look at crisis, whether it is a functioning immediate crisis like COVID, or let's take the bigger long-term crises like demographics. Our families are not having enough children, right? We're going to have an aging population. What does that mean to your industry? What are we going to do about immigration? We're going to have wholesale immigration, or we're going to have careful immigration. What is it going to be like? If we have a lot of immigration, how do we maintain the stability of our political dynamics? What's best for the country? What's best for your industry? The classic is technology, right? I mean, almost every war in the end has been won by technological change. You just pointed it out. What was one of the major strategic agility factors of COVID? Zoom, Teams, video. We can work from home. Oh, now, by the way, now that's causing all kinds of its own issues, right? Yes. Who the heck wants to go back to work and commute anymore? Yet, what do we miss out from that? So, as I mentioned, very often when we look at change, when we look at these pieces, that if we embrace it, and if a leader, I think the leader almost always has to be the glass is half full. Who's going to follow you if you're a pessimist? But if you lead with character, that is to say, you lead with empathy, you lead with humility, you lead with perceptivity, that you really look carefully at your people and understand their needs. We go back to Maslow, right? The old hierarchy of needs. What's the great motivator? The great motivator is the unsatisfied need. The degree to which a leader recognizes the unsatisfied need, not just in the total organization, But how about in your customers? How about in your subordinates? The more you can identify the unsatisfied need, the more successful you're going to be as a leader.
One of the things, in the spirit of past, present, future, because I think leadership is always about, you don't want to live in the past. You want to understand the past. You want to be, engaged in the present and then plan for the future, but not live in the future. Of course, I had to use ChatGPT because in preparation for this, especially the new version, because deep research at least sources everything out. And I'm going to just share 4 thoughts that it had around the 4 leaders that we've mentioned. And I'd like you to react around strategic patience. So if we talked about, I love this term, by the way, that I've never heard that I want to unpack. So I basically asked ChatGPT, what were the differences in leadership styles? And here's how it bucketed it. And then, so maybe react to those 4 buckets. And then let's talk about strategic patience with all 4 of them. So the first one with George Washington, it called them the reluctant founder. Abraham Lincoln, the empathetic strategist. Theodore Roosevelt, the force of nature. And Winston Churchill, the wartime orator. So that's the 4 buckets that ChatGPT gave to it.
That's interesting because did you check on Franklin Roosevelt or just Theodore Roosevelt?
Just Theodore.
Okay.
Like, you would have put that for Franklin and not for Theodore?
Well, it's interesting that you said it. Let's go back to George Washington first. And he has this share of success and failures in the French and Indian War. He really learns from that. And then they make him colonel of militia, and he goes out to Western Virginia, and he's supposed to establish a regiment to protect the frontier from Indians and the French, really starting from scratch. He learns a lot, and he gets rebuffed a number of times by British generals because he is very anxious to get a British commission. Now, thank the good Lord that he doesn't. He goes with Braddock on this faithful journey to go out to Fort Necessity, which we think really of Pittsburgh now. You're out in that area. Keeps telling him, you're going to get ambushed, you're going to get ambushed. And they really don't listen to him. They do get ambushed. And he has bullet holes in his coat. The horse is shot out from underneath him. But he's the only one left that rallies the troops and gets them back. So he gets another chance, and he's written up as kind of a hero. He's easily frustrated, though. He goes to the House of Burgess in Williamsburg and discovers he's not a very good speaker. And he ends up going back to planning and marrying Martha Washington. And he grows up. And when, during this period of time, his political acumen comes to being, he's actually involved with George Mason, who lived down the road from him, in writing the Fairfax Resolutions, which were early on, right? In the late 1760s, saying, wait a minute, the British aren't treating us like the British citizens we are. So he learns this sense of being, he learns this sense of patience, he learns how to listen. Boy, when he takes command, he's incredibly organized. And he has to develop some patience because he's dealing with people from all over the country. I mean, we talk about diversity. I mean, believe me, New England was so different from people from South Carolina, you can't believe it. And we were already heavily diversified. Heck, we had Irish regiments, we had German regiments. It was extraordinary. So you see this beginning. I think he was much more than a reluctant leader. He wanted to be there. But he learned some humility. He learned not to appear to want power. And in the end, he lived it. He gave up power at the end of the war. He was reluctant to come back to the Constitutional Convention. He gives up power at the end of his presidency. What happens every time he gives up power? He gets more because people trust him. Lincoln It's interesting. He certainly, in his daily communication with people, had that wonderful sense of humor. And we have example after example where he consoled the widows who lost their soldiers. There's no question he had a sense of empathy. But let me tell you, I would say he had strategic vision and persistence and determination. And he could stomach failure better than anybody. And this is amazing because he had a depressive streak in him. He had a depressive streak. We shouldn't overlook that. He had what in those days they called melancholy. I think he had vision. He had strength. He had persistence. Now, whether we're talking about Teddy Roosevelt or Franklin Roosevelt, I would argue that they were both forces of nature. Teddy Roosevelt, pure energy, right? But brilliant. And a tremendous, again, visionary. He could see this great industrial complex being built, but he also knew that he had to push back against his patrician roots and really stand up for the working man and woman. He had to break up the cartels. I mean, it's amazing what he did.
So much. So I was taking a few notes as I was listening to you. One of my favorite books is Team Arrivals. I mean, I think it's a must read. I've gifted it many times. And I think it talks to the character of Lincoln, where I think if I were to summarize it for the audience is, imagine taking your fiercest competitors in the primary and then saying, hey, now that I'm your leader, I'm going to put you on my team because I want neurodivergence in terms of being challenged. I want different visions and point of views on where we're going as a country. That takes some serious character and belief in self to surround yourself with, let's call it your enemies after you've debated and probably insulted each other and so forth. Any thoughts on Team Arrivals? I'd love, since we're chatting.
Well, I think it is it's a great book. I've heard Doris Kearns Goodwin speak on it a number of times. I think she's dead on. I think it is one of the great lessons of history for all of us leaders. We've got to surround ourselves with strong people. And we have to figure out how to get the best out of all of them. They didn't always get along with each other either. One of them, as you well know, called Lincoln, I believe it was a long-armed, hairy ape during the primary. And he put him in the cabinet. So getting by pettiness is a critical notion. Leaders have got to be a little above the fray. It goes back to understanding the needs of each individual, right? Is that fine line. We want our leaders, men or women, to be alphas. They've got to be out there. But they've also got to be patient, and they've got to be patient enough to understand others. They've got to be patient enough to bring everybody together. Now, everybody does it differently. Lincoln used humor and his incredibly quick and bright intellect. I think Churchill did a lot of that. I mean, Churchill was just unbelievably quick, and he had a lot of detractors. He had detractors all over England, but he was the right man for the right time, pretty clearly. Washington's a little different. I think a number of historians would agree with this. Think of Washington as wise. Look, he's very, very smart. Don't misunderstand me. He's incredibly intuitively smart. But I wouldn't say brilliant in an academic sense or even brilliant in a pure military sense. He was incredibly wise. His sense of the big picture was extraordinary. His practicality, his ability to see through the weeds and stay on the big picture. And he really did learn to listen. I mean, the decision, I'll give you one example, but after the Battle of Trenton II, they had to make a decision. We try to run around the British and retreat to Philadelphia. What do? They didn't want things to look like a retreat. There was a major in his army who'd grown up in New Jersey who told Brigadier General St. Pierre, look, I know this road. We can go up the back road. we can get out of here at night. We can maybe capture Princeton and beat feet to the Highlands. That wasn't Washington's idea. But he got very good at councils of war. He really did listen. They're different, but they're all great collaborators, right? They bring people together. And we talk about collaboration here a lot.
You know, what's interesting is as I study these four individuals that we're talking about, these leaders, it's clear that, look, to be a prime minister, to be a president, you need extreme range. Of the four, as you've studied, and I'm sure sometimes you feel like they're your friends because you've immersed yourself in their world, polymaths, would you put them in that bucket? Like generalists versus specialists? Because there's always that debate in leadership, right? Do you become a specialist? So if we were to bring it back even to our IFDA community, is it better to be a specialist in 2025 or is it better to be a generalist? And I guess learning from the four great leaders that we're referencing throughout our conversation, are they all polymaths? Is one of them that you would kind of say, no, this person was everything, all four? So I know that's a big question, but I just would like to get your reflection on that.
If you're in the food distribution business, you've got to know what food needs to be preserved and what doesn't, right? What food needs to get to the market more quickly than other food, right? You've got to be good at certain customer things. You've got to be good at real estate. What should my supermarkets look like, or trucks? And I think that's true in warfare. I mean, eventually Washington had to have enough technical knowledge to know I need cannons.
Yes.
But he was a generalist. What did he do? He got Knox, who was a 300-pound former bookseller in Boston, who had read everything in the world about artillery.
Right.
Brought him on. He said, boy, we need cannons. Knox said, I know where cannons are. They're up at Fort Ticonderoga. Washington says, go get them. By God, he does it. Okay? So, yes, you've got to be a generalist. You've got to have a broad sense of people. So you got to have some technical knowledge. I wouldn't separate the two.
I think as I look at all these themes, there is an underlying theme around collaboration as well. So as an admiral in the Navy, let's talk about collaboration between your counterparts, because if I look at Desert Storm, for instance, how do you collaborate with, because there's going to be egos, there's going to be different expertise. Our team is better positioned to go in first, your team. So maybe talk a bit about personal experience, and then maybe is there lessons around collaboration from the four great leaders that we've been talking about? I think that would be a great place to anchor our conversation.
There's a wonderful picture of Rochambeau, the French general, pointing the way south as Washington is there with the others. And as the story goes, we're toward the end of the war. Both sides are very tired. And Washington, in a letter, says it's now or never. And the general in charge, Cromwell, in New York, had sent 7,500 more troops to the south to support Cornwallis, who had been fairly successfully invading South and North Carolina and was now in Virginia. But he had run afoul of General Nathaniel Greene, who had become a great general and had lured him into the swamps. And also what I call General Malaria and General Yellow Fever. So Washington says to Rochambeau, now's the time to attack in New York. Rochambeau's been up in Newport, Rhode Island, and oh, by the way, there were no mansions there then. He'd been living on the land, and he had a chunk of the French Navy up there to help him. They meet, and Rochambeau says, basically, my dear General, this will never work. They're done again. We cannot do a major siege of New York City. And oh, by the way, I'm the great French siege general from Europe. I have a lot of experience. So the great lesson is Washington listens and Washington trusts across a great cultural divide.
What do you think collaboration could look like or should look like for this industry? Was there some key learnings when you're in your role that you could share your wisdom here?
Absolutely, because, and I hope your members will forgive me, I think we have some very similar issues. Suppliers, wholesalers, brokers, and retailers. Now, in many cases, of course, the same big companies will have the chain all the way through that. But still, there are great similarities. And in the early days of mine, suppliers were seen as kind of the big dogs. The wholesalers got very smart. They started to come together. They merged, acquisitions. Wholesalers became every bit as powerful as the suppliers. And some of that happened on the retail side, where the retailers came together and we had huge chains. Think of organizations that your folks probably service, Total Wine and Spirits. I mean, they probably got, 200 stores around the country now or more. Look at ABC in Florida. They've got at least 150 stores. The Twins in Texas. So all of these folks had to learn to cooperate around what the key issues were. And what we did was identify the key issues. What were they? Well, for spirits, we had to be able to compete with beer and wine. And we had, unfortunately, put our head in the sands way back in 1948 when TV came out. So we wanted to go undercover. And beer was advertising on TV. Wine didn't have to. It wasn't a big deal then. We didn't. And over time, beer took back a huge amount of market share. And then wine came along, became very trendy. It was either ethnic or was part of a meal. You couldn't get drunk on wine, that kind of thing.
Yep.
And spirits is left out. So we had to reestablish our cultural acceptance. It's not how much you drink, it's not what you drink, it's how much you drink, right? And so we had to come together, retailers, wholesalers, and suppliers, to get that message out. And one important way of getting that message out was to really be truly socially responsible. You aren't going to get legislators to buy your pablum if they can't trust you and they can't believe you. So we really had to come together to work on that. And that wasn't always easy. But eventually, we established a very strict code of our advertising code. And we found ways to cooperate at all of these levels and recognize that the end goal was, to my beer friends, I apologize, to take back market share from beer.
Look, the one thing I'm getting as I'm digesting what you're saying there is having a mission or a rally cry that pulls everybody together. And again, I hate to go back to 2020, but if you talk to Mark Allen, our fearless leader at IFDA, man, together is better. Like as soon as the crisis hit, it was all hands on deck. How do we lobby? How do we have a unified front? How do we make sure to take care of our people? And on and on. And it was probably the most connected that I've felt in my 25 plus years being in the food distribution industry. So it's interesting how, a crisis, how it's handled can lead to great things.
You are an essential industry.
Yes.
You're absolutely essential. And the public takes you for granted because you're so darn good at what you do, right? And boy, when they saw this burp, it was concerning, and it should have been concerning. And yet, when I look back at it, I think it's miraculous at what it was done. I mean, I have had a long-standing relationship with the International Dairy Food Association.
Oh, yes.
And they almost have the same acronym that you do. One letter switched.
Yeah, change a few letters.
And at that time, they still had to get milk all the way in. They were spilling milk out. You had to keep milking the cows. I mean, the public needs to understand how difficult it is, how tricky it is. I think one common thing all of you can have is educating the public on the food chain, joining forces with agriculture. I mean, it's a big deal. We talk about America being, but One at the same time, we want to be self-sufficient in manufacturing and in agriculture, but we're still a global economy. We've got to have both. We're going to make profits by being the world's great supplier of food. And boy, this is where George Washington comes in. Well, I can show you chapter and verse as he talks about, I mean, he's the first guy that I know of who used terms like we could be the granary of the world, right? Got to be able to feed ourselves even as we eat up more farmland. We've got to be able to have that perfect relationship with agriculture and understand that we all have concerns about water consumption. And where is water going to be with climate change? How are we going to move it? So there are big issues. I think there are big issues that IFDA can coalesce around and should coalesce around. And I have no doubt they'll do it.
And it comes back. There's a common theme here as we were looking at whether it's Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt, either of the Roosevelts, Churchill, is storytelling. And I think you're right. I think there is an opportunity as we collaborate and come together as one is what does the story, what's the united front that we want to put forward? Because to your point, I think the industry, if I talk specifically IFDA, there's a lot of unsung heroes. It kind of just happens magically and you show up at a restaurant and then you enjoy your steak, you enjoy your fish, and you don't realize all the things that have to go in place in order to get there. Well, look, I want to finish here. If you could only pick one word to describe your leadership style, realizing that you've played in academia, you've played in private sector, you've played in obviously military, what word would you choose and why?
And I can't say that I do this, but I can say what I think leaders should think about. First of all, creating trust, being credible. That requires listening and visibility. Can't all be visible like George Washington.
No.
We're not. I mean, George Washington in his day was 6'2.5" when the average male was 5'7.5". Got on a horse in a uniform. He was an incredible figure.
Yes.
When we don't have to ride into our offices on a big white Charger. But we do have to be credible. We do have to listen. And you can't do that without a certain sense of empathy and humility. You've got to be aggressive. We have to make decisions. That's what we're paid to do. You've got to be decisive. You can't get to the right decisions if you don't listen and get the right information. You can't be in a position to listen if you're not visible and if you haven't created an atmosphere of trust where people are willing to speak up.
Wow.
It's more than a sentence, but that's right.
Well, I'll tell you, that's a hell of a t-shirt because we could put all these key words. And if you were to live and breathe these words, that's called leadership. And look, I mean, I'd like to really, really thank you for your generosity of time and insights and how well prepared. And I mean, I could listen to all day and I can't wait. I do want to come and spend a day with you there at the Institute because it sounds amazing what you're doing over there. And I think a lot of our IFDA community members would absolutely benefit from spending some time at your Institute as well.
Well, we hope that the companies will feel free to bring their boards here. Bring their staffs here for strategic retreats. As you can see, it's a beautiful, beautiful place. We have wonderful facilities. And I think we do a good job of customizing programs through the lens of history, which meet your needs, not our needs, your needs. We try to listen very hard when people approach us on what they want to accomplish, and then we work hard to deliver that. But I've enjoyed this. Wonderful questions. Thank you very much. Quite challenging, but I always enjoy that. Thank you.
Well, I knew you didn't want fluffy questions here. I knew that you're up for a good challenge. Huh? And look, I'm going to thank you listeners for investing time in your personal development. And hopefully you can take some of these insights from these amazing leaders over the course of history and your thoughts that you shared with us, Peter. And with that said, I'm also going to thank Cut and Dry because this wouldn't be possible if we wouldn't have a sponsor. And with that said, go get them.
This episode is brought to you by Cut and Dry, the only independently verified digital ordering platform that combines e-commerce, payments, and sales tools to help food service distributors sell over 10% more cases within a year. Here's the truth. E-commerce isn't just about going digital. It's about getting discovered. That's why, since 2009, Cut and Dry has led the industry in transforming your inventory into online custom apps that are easy to search, explore, and for your customers to uncover new products. Join us today at cutanddry.com.